All right, ko huri tātou nānei ki te kai kōrero whakamutinga. We're moving now to our final guest, Mr. Hamiora Gibson. Obviously, many of us know him as Sam the Trap Man, living with and off rather than locking up our indigenous ngahere. Looking forward to this conversation. Hamiora, kei a koe te wā.
Kia ora tātou, I'm Hamiora Gibson, Sam the Trap Man, and we're going to be yarning about living with the Whenua, living with the ngahere. And so when I got given this kaupapa of recloaking the Whenua as something to talk about, I had a couple of questions. It brought up questions of how do we optimise our biodiversity in our ngahere. So we know that we can create all these big, beautiful canopies of manuka and regenerating forest, but how do we really get the best out of the biodiversity that lays underneath that canopy system? How do we strengthen our resolve as a people to recloak the Whenua? How do we motivate our people to want to plant forests across our landscapes? And is it better to utilise our traditional model of removing people from those landscapes and from the ngahere to protect our forests, or is it better to reconnect our people with the intricacies of those ecosystems? In my experience, people feel a connection where they spend the most time. So if they're spending time in the ngahere, they're feeling a really deep care for that place. This connection's enhanced to a reliance when we use our ngahere to harvest kai, to harvest different tipu for our rongoa and for our mental well-being as well. When people, they spend time in the ngahere sort of harvesting things, they start to understand all the different details within that ecosystem. And like an example of that would be with our riparian planting. If we have an intrinsic connection to our riparian plantings, then life gets busy. We only go and visit them maybe once or twice a year to release weed them, and that's when we notice what's going on in that ecosystem. But if we're in there harvesting kai from those places, we're going to visit it once or twice a week, because that's the place that we eat from. It's the place we gather rongoa from. It's the place that sustains us. And in those ecosystems, when you're harvesting, you're noticing each individual plant, what's going on for each individual plant. You'll notice that rabbit browse, that hare browse, that deer browse, when that cow jumped that fence and got into your planting, and you'll be able to respond within a week. If you had an intrinsic connection rather than a harvesting connection, you would only notice that 6 months later down the track when it's too late and your riparian planting has been totally cleaned out. And currently, with our traditional model, our people have been kind of kept at arm's width from our ngahere. Pine forests kind of coat the outside of our forest systems. Legislation means that on public conservation land, you're unable to harvest our traditional species. It all goes back to land confiscation and people being kept at arm's width to protect native species. I want to talk a little bit about the legalities around having a living relationship with the ngahere right now. It's illegal for people to harvest native species, traditional kai, from our bush on public land, unless we apply to the Department of Conservation for a customary harvest permit. So who can apply for a customary harvesting permit? Tangata whenua can apply, and it has to be within their rohe. That means that when you're living outside of your rohe, you can't just nip down to your local dot reserve and harvest a feed of piko piko or ko wao, or even kawa kawa for a tea, can't harvest koromiko for your puku, etc. And these permits are approved at a local dock level. They're approved by our local managers, and they're approved on a one-off thing. So if you want to go and harvest some kawa kawa for some tea today, you need a customary harvesting permit, but you can't just get one for the remainder of the year or the remainder of your life. So there's a strange thing here that through this kind of clunky process that gets signed off at a local dock area manager level, people aren't being encouraged to interact with the bush. They're not being encouraged to really look in detail at the biodiversity. And I don't know if that's our end goal. We want people to have a connection. We want people to live with the ngahere. We want people to care about that place and that individual species. So we probably need some legislative change if we want people to have those types of relationships. I want to talk a little bit about 2 examples around how I've seen people interacting with our ecosystems through harvest to actually create real positive biodiversity change. So everyone knows tawa, right? Tawa is this slightly turpentine but delicious fruit. The fruit's tasty and the kernel, the nut inside, can be roasted and stored for a long period of time. Tawa, to create the fruit, it fruits on the fresh growth of that tawa tree. And so when that tawa tree grows, it creates fruit. That fruit falls to the ground. It's good kai for us, but it's also really good kai for pigs. And so pigs, in your sort of spring and your summer, they live on the farmland eating all the grass grubs. But when the tawa starts to fruit, they love it so much that they will actually migrate from that farmland where our hunters don't have permission to hunt them typically, into the native bush, into the public conservation lands, and they just gorge themselves on tawa and they become really fat. Hey? Also, our hunters, they're free fall for hunters, so everyone can hunt them on public conservation land. So that there is the content. A friend of mine sent me that picture. That there's a porridge of tawa kernel and tawa fruit. That's the contents of a pig's puku when he's living in the ngahere and eating tawa. Interestingly though, the biggest pressure on tawa is possums. So possums, they eat that fresh growth of the tawa tree, and it stops the tawa being able to fruit. And when there's no fruit on the ground, there's no kai for us when we're hunting, but there's also no pig migration. So when the pigs don't migrate, there's no pork, there's no fat pork for our freezers. That's not a great thing. So the real fallout of that is that our pig hunters have become our greatest possum trappers and our greatest advocates for possum trapping. So pig hunters in winter typically are trapping possums, but also catching pigs. So that's how the tawa fruit and understanding the ecosystem through harvesting tawa fruit and pork motivates our people to care for the ngahere and trap those possums, increasing our biodiversity. Similarly, there's a relationship between deer and mo'uku. Any hunter knows that you don't want to carry heavy tucker into the bush and you don't want to live on dehydrated meals. So when we're in the ngahere, we go and harvest a feed of piko from the mo'uku plant. And also we notice that that's the best place to find deer. So deer in winter, the grass from the river flats is gone, but the mo'uku beds are really lush and delicious. So the deer just go there, and that's where we shoot the deer. However, as hunters, we notice the impact that these deer have. So when your mo'uku bed's been chewed out, there's no piko for us to eat, there's no vegetables for us to eat in the bush, and the deer, there's no food for them either. So hungry deer, a skinny deer, they're not fat. It's our role as hunters to provide fat venison for our freezers, but we also want to be able to harvest a feed of vegetables in the bush. It's a really big motivator for hunters to shoot out the hinds from our deer population, and a really big motivator for hunters to cull those deer back and protect our biodiversity and our ecosystem. If hunters didn't eat piko, I don't think they'd be motivated to shoot hinds and to look after the biodiversity of our ngahere. That's an example of a skinny deer. So the key to me for a thriving ecosystem is connecting people. It's a no-brainer. We want people to be out there, interacting, understanding ecosystems, and creating that ecosystem literacy. The key to protecting a particular species is to retain a strong relationship with it. And an intrinsic relationship oftentimes isn't enough. We need a harvesting relationship of some sorts, a symbiotic relationship. We eat the piko, but we also shoot the deer to protect the mo'uku plant. And to do this, we need a slight shift in legislation and a big shift in mindset. We need DOC to allow us to harvest foods off of public conservation lands every year for our lifetimes. Doesn't matter if you're tangata whenua or you're manuhiri, we need more flexibility within that model for people to have those relationships and gain the ecosystem literacy to be able to make positive management decisions. My end goal for Aotearoa is a community that has a strong connection to the ngahere and that we've got a great abundance of biodiversity because we've got that ecosystem literacy and we're making good management decisions. That's me.
Thank you very much, Sam, aka Hamiora Gibson there.